This is an absolutely global problem, and a lot of it is because about 71% of all calories consumed globally are carbohydrates, often refined, and we've been told to eat 5 or 6 times a day. And so you never give your body a chance to lower the insulin.
Dr. Ben Bikman, you are the insulin guru. You know so much about that. That is your world of expertise. Can you tell me, how does insulin inhibit fat loss?
Right. Yeah, the primary mechanism is a direct inhibition of lipolysis. So lipolysis is the term we use to refer to the breakdown of fat from the fat cell. Now, people will often say fat burning, but that's not fat burning. Fat burning is the end fate. That's what the fat is going to go and do after it comes out of the fat cell. So before we ever have fat burning or the oxidation, we have the breakdown or the lipolysis. Insulin has this chokehold on lipolysis. And if insulin levels start to climb, it will inhibit lipolysis no matter what other stimulus is present. So you can try to be stimulating lipolysis with catecholamines like adrenaline, for example. And if insulin is elevated over, even slightly over fasted levels, it immediately starts to depress that signal to the point that once you've gone a couple multiples over fasted levels, which is very easy to do with insulin, you've shut off lipolysis entirely. So largely, the primary effect of insulin controlling weight loss is its effect on lipolysis. And again, to state that clearly, as insulin goes up, lipolysis drops. You shut it off. But as much as people don't acknowledge this, insulin absolutely influences the front end as well, which is the movement of fat. But it depends on the size of the fat cell. So while there's a lot of controversy and debate on insulin's ability or insulin's acting as a stimulus to pull the fat in to the fat cell, it depends on the size of the fat cell. Smaller fat cells, insulin does stimulate fatty acid uptake into the fat cells. So as much as it controls the back end of the fat cell by regulating lipolysis, it does in fact also influence the front end, particularly in smaller fat cells. And as the fat cell gets larger, that effect becomes somewhat diminished. And now insulin isn't controlling fat uptake, but it's still controlling the exit of it, so the leaving of the fat or the lipolysis. So, so with these two ideas combined, if someone can appreciate pretty quickly how insulin really does control the growth and the shrinking of the fat cell.
So is a smaller fat cell essentially just a newer fat cell? Is there hyperplasia with fat cells? Like, can you develop, is a small fat cell necessarily a new fat cell, or what defines a small or a large fat cell?
Yeah. So for me, when I'm saying define, I actually mean like on the order of microns, like how many micrometers is its diameter. It doesn't necessarily mean it's a new one, although it certainly could. But some people genetically have the ability to make new fat cells. And in fact, one of the sexes does in particular areas. But referencing some people first, a paper published decades ago found that in the average obese population, about 80% of this mixed ethnicity population has gotten obese through hypertrophy. So the number of fat cells hasn't changed, but the size of the fat cells have. So that's the hypertrophy of the fat cell, which is particularly pathogenic. When a fat cell gets big or fat, then it becomes very insulin resistant and very pro-inflammatory. However, a small fat cell, and this is again a subset, let's say about 15% of people who can become obese or do become obese, they have this genetic ability to continue to make new fat cells. And so to kind of come back to your question, those would be younger fat cells. They haven't had time to get big, but they also don't have the metabolic pressure to get big. Because in that individual who genetically can continue to make fat cells, every time the fat cell starts to get a little bit of growth pressure on it, it recruits a new fat cell. And so no fat cell ever gets too big. And those are the people who paradoxically can both become fantastically obese and yet still not become type 2 diabetic and insulin resistant. And these are the people that they make TV shows about. The fact is, most people around the entire world could never get to 600 pounds.
I put a link down below for Thrive Market. I know this is a relevant pitch for them, but at the same time, it makes sense. There's a 30% off discount link down below. Thrive Market is an online membership-based grocery store, and it literally is their mission to make healthier food more available for people in areas that cannot get healthier food. They really wanted to make sustainability a real thing and be able to get real good, unprocessed, and even healthier processed food options into people's hands. So that link down below is a 30% off discount link for whatever you choose. You can fill up your grocery cart using that link, 30% off plus a free $60 gift. So 30% off whether you choose some beet chips or whether you choose siete tortilla chips instead of regular corn chips, or if you want jerky snacks or this or that. And a lot of the times it's going to be much, much cheaper than you would find at many grocery stores. So that link is down below. It's in the top line of the description underneath this video. And again, 30% off and a free $60 gift.
You and I, very, very likely, statistically, we could do everything we could to try to get to 600 pounds, and as the fat cells get bigger and bigger and bigger, they become more and more insulin resistant, and thus become less sensitive to insulin signal attempting to tell them to continue to get big. And that's because the fat cell can reach about 20 times its normal dimensions, which is unlike any cell. There's no cell in the body that can grow 20 times its kind of native size. But as the fat cell begins to approach this maximum dimension, it starts to become resistant to insulin, all in an effort to prevent itself from literally bursting like an overfilled water balloon. And so these people who genetically continue to make fat cells, they are getting fatter and fatter and fatter, but they still maintain their insulin sensitivity, which means they can continue to get fat as it's continuing to get stored in small fat cells. In fact, we see this even in clinical practice. One of the most effective anti-diabetic drugs, so a drug that would be prescribed to someone with type 2 diabetes, who almost always is going to be a little overweight, and there's very much an ethnic component to that, but even still, they may be prescribed a class of drug called a thiazolidinedione, or a TZD. These drugs will improve their insulin sensitivity very, very well, but paradoxically, because it makes them fatter, it actually stimulates their body's ability to make new fat cells. And so on one hand, they have this situation where they're getting fatter and fatter with every dose they're taking every month, and yet at the same time, their diabetes is getting better. It's because they're allowing the big hypertrophic fat cells to start sharing some of that burden with the new fat cells. And so I'm such an advocate of the idea of people acknowledging this by stating it's not the mass of fat we have that matters most when it comes to insulin resistance. It's how you're storing your fat. Are you storing your fat in hypertrophic, fewer but fatter fat cells, or more abundant, or hyperplastic, more abundant but smaller fat cells? And this is very much at the heart of why across the spectrum of ethnicities, why on one hand you have, say, a Chinese ethnicity man who has among the lowest tolerances to store fat. The Chinese typically, on average, that body type has a very limited number of fat cells. And so if that person is eating a diet where insulin is stimulated and to stimulate the growth of the fat, and there's sufficient calories to fuel that growth, because you need both of them, you can't have fat growth without both of those, then he has a very low threshold of fat gain. A little bit of fat on his body, he's just mildly chubby and he already is pre-diabetic, he has hypertension, he has fatty liver disease. On the far other end of the spectrum, you have the typical Caucasian kind of Northern European ethnicity, which is the most abundant ethnicity in the US, me and you included. That is an ethnicity, that's a body type that has a slightly higher potential to make new fat cells. And so that's a body type where he got just as fat as his Chinese buddy, and yet he's still fine. He just doesn't look as good in his Speedo as he used to. But he doesn't have any sign of fatty liver disease or any sign of prediabetes, but he's just as fat as his old Chinese college roommate was. That's the personal fat threshold idea, but again, it's not because a person reaches a particular mass of fat. You would basically ask the question, how full are your fat cells? And the moment those fat cells are full, now those fat cells become insulin resistant and they become pro-inflammatory to try to correct blood flow, which is a different issue. But the combination of those variables basically leads to that being the first domino to fall along this cascade, and then the liver becomes insulin resistant, the muscle, etc.
Is that why, like for example, like gluteal-femoral fat is considered more protective?
Mm-hmm. I don't
want to say protective, but it's
it absolutely is. I think it's an appropriate word to use. In fact, it allows me to come back to what I'd alluded to, where in women, you have higher levels of estrogens, and estrogens signal a greater subcutaneous hyperplasia. So particularly on the butt and hips, or with these higher levels of estradiol in particular, the sex hormones tell the body where to store fat and even how. It's still insulin that tells the body how much fat to store, but again, sufficient calories to fuel that storage. But the sex hormones tell the body where to store fat. And so as estradiol levels are higher, it signals more hyperplasia of that fat beneath the skin, which is absolutely a healthy, protective place to store fat. And it is more hyperplastic. So much to the woman's chagrin, she has the ability to get fatter at her butt and hips, and yet it keeps her healthier. But that's what transitions with menopause. As her estradiol levels, the estrogens start to come down. I like to joke when I teach endocrinology to my students that at that point the woman becomes a metabolic mortal. That prior to that, she is like she's bulletproof metabolically. She is fatter than her male counterpart at every point in her life, and yet she's healthier in every cardiometabolic marker than her male counterpart is. After menopause, now she's immortal. Now, if she has as much fat as her male counterpart does, it's going to start to cause cardiometabolic problems because she doesn't store it as much in that subcutaneous space at the butt and hips. It begins to be more stored centrally, just like it is on her male counterpart.
So how come today we're seeing more like apple-shaped women than we were even 20 years ago? Like what's different in younger women now? Is it just like an accelerated aging effect that's kind of happening with insulin resistance? Yeah. What's happening there, in your opinion?
Yeah. So I do have to speculate. I would suspect it's in part due to a greater consumption of fructose. There are some nutrients that are metabolized, let's say poorly, if you will, that lead to altered fat storage. So there was a study done in humans, males and females, that gave them isocaloric drinks of high glucose or high fructose. Both gained some degree of fat during the course of the study, but where they gained the fat was totally different. The high glucose drinkers gained relatively more subcutaneous fat, so the pinchable, jiggable fat, which generally predominates on the female body, whereas the fructose drinking population had more visceral adipose. So at a minimum, I suspect part of it could be the effect of how the liver in particular is metabolizing fructose and then dumping that fructose turned into fat into that kind of portal circulation, which is going to feed through visceral adipocytes first. So even still, that's speculative, but we know for a fact in humans, all calories equal, well, they're not, but fructose consumption will selectively promote greater visceral adipose storage. And of course, fructose, that's not only like from fruit juice, but even sugar, of course. Any enriched source of fructose would have the potential to contribute to that.
Is there sort of an upper threshold of fructose, or is it really genetically dependent? Like, I mean, can some people, since fructose isn't really involved in glycogen resynthesis of the muscle or anything like that, like you can't necessarily exercise your way out of that in a lot of ways. Yet, you've got people that are athletes that consume a fair bit of fructose, yet they still have good cardiometabolic parameters and good biomarkers, and they don't have. So is it somewhat bio-individual? Is there a rough number where, hey, like, because I know like if you're eating just fruit, it's kind of hard to reach a ridiculous amount of fructose.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, so that's a great question. And I don't really have my finger on the pulse of that research enough, but I'll speculate because I'm a professor and I'm used to speculating. In this case, I would say that it's interesting to me to note people who have become advocates of consuming high fructose sources, they're always lean and healthy. I would be interested to see someone who advocates a lot of fructose consumption who is overweight and diabetic. And so I don't know that there is an inherent genetic ability to tolerate fructose a little better, although there certainly could be. We know that there are certain groups of people who metabolize alcohol better. And why would I even invoke alcohol? The one similarity between fructose and alcohol is that they both primarily rely on the liver for their metabolism. So just as we know there are people who are able to more rapidly metabolize alcohol, it wouldn't surprise me if there are people who can more rapidly metabolize and tolerate fructose. But even still, I do think it's important to control the dose. That whole fruit, for me, one of the first cardinal rules of eating a diet to improve insulin sensitivity is control carbs. And when I invoke that mantra, it really is to help people understand the value of whole fruits and vegetables, not juiced fruits and vegetables. And I think to me, that's the divider. If this is a population or a person who's eating whole fruit, then I generally would give that a thumbs up, depending on where they're coming from. If this is an overweight, severely type 2 diabetic, there may be some fruits that would be a little more problematic than others, but any would be better than drinking the fruit.
Yeah. I want to bounce back just before I forget. 2 questions on the insulin piece with sort of suppressing lipolysis. Is it a dimmer switch more so than a light switch? And if it is a dimmer switch, does it, as you start to crank it up or down, does it gain more momentum as you're cranking it up to 11? If you have an insulin release and its ability to allow fat into a young or a new fat or a small fat cell, when you have a little bit of insulin, is there a little bit of momentum, and does it increase? Does it kind of gain momentum with more?
Yeah, that's a good question. So to answer the first part of the question very definitively, it is absolutely a dimmer. Yeah. It is completely a function of degrees, and you can titrate this beautifully in like living, breathing humans. You can monitor this over time, where the product of lipolysis. So when we're talking about breaking down the fat from the fat cell, the stored form of the fat in the fat cell is triglycerides. The product of the lipolysis is free fatty acids, sometimes referred to as non-esterified fatty acids, but free fatty acids. And you can get this measured on a blood test, albeit it's not uncommonly. However, my point about the kind of titrating or the changing the dose, if insulin skyrockets, give that body a few minutes, and if you're measuring free fatty acids, the free fatty acids plummet and go to almost undetectable very, very quickly. In contrast, the more you give the body time to allow the insulin to come down, and the fastest way to do that, of course, is fasting. So if a fast starts from this point of really high insulin and essentially no lipolysis, so free fatty acids basically baseline, and then the more time you're giving them, you can see this beautiful crossover. And Dr. George Cahill, a legend in the field of fasting, or what he called starvation research, we would call it fasting, he really has published some beautiful papers that show these kinds of figures, where when insulin would start to get to around 10 microunits per mil, you could immediately start to see this reduction. So the insulin's coming up, you'd start to see this reduction in the free fatty acids. But then back to the paradigm I'd outlined a moment ago, if you take a fed individual and start fasting them, as insulin starts coming down, you can see this steady decline hour after hour of the free fatty acids coming up. But that's right there, if you'll allow me, Thomas, there's an interesting test that someone can do at home. So I've presented the viewpoint that the first cell or tissue that becomes insulin resistant is the fat cell. And I defend that vigorously. Because of this, you can actually combine the 2 variables that I just mentioned into what I consider to be one of the best tests for detecting insulin resistance at the earliest possible stage. In other words, the moment it's starting at the fat cells. So as we go back to that hypertrophic fat cell, as it starts to become insulin resistant, insulin levels are high. There's no such thing as insulin resistance without elevated insulin. You cannot pull those 2 apart. If it's insulin resistance, insulin levels are high. Well, with what I just mentioned, if insulin levels are high, we would expect free fatty acids to be low, unless the fat cells have become hypertrophic and now they're insulin resistant. Now we have this metabolic oddity where both insulin is elevated and free fatty acids are elevated. This is a particularly pathogenic state because while the fat cells are full and they can't handle anymore, if insulin is up, you can't burn that fat. Normally, you only have high free fatty acids when insulin is low, and because insulin is low, you can now burn it. Beta oxidation, or the burning of the fat, is just going like gangbusters. So much so that you're burning more than you need and you start making ketones, which is a different topic. But if you have both high insulin and high free fatty acids, now you start storing those free fatty acids in tissues that are ill-suited for long-term fat storage. This is this idea of ectopic fat deposition, where now you're storing fat in your muscles, in your pancreas, in your liver. So you have all of these fatty deposits in tissues that are not designed to store fat, but it's because when you have high insulin and high free fatty acids, you can't burn that fat. You have to store it. It's just you can't store it in the fat tissue anymore.
Does the same thing apply with high amounts of co-ingestion of fats and carbs together at the same time, or do we have a way to partition?
That's a great question. If you have a lot of fat and carb together, that is a particularly fattening mix, because you have both of the two components. So first of all, you would burn glucose as the primary fuel in that state, because insulin dictates fuel use. In fact, on my little YouTube channel, I just finished a lecture about the Randall cycle, or the glucose fatty acid cycle, and described how it really is at its heart a manifestation of insulin. If insulin is low, the body is sugar burning or glucose burning. If insulin's high, sugar burning. If insulin's low, fat burning. If you've spiked insulin because of the glucose consumption, and you've won with the high insulin, you have signaled the fat cell that it's time to grow. But that alone is insufficient. If I took you and injected a dose of insulin in you, that would, yes, stimulate fat cell growth by pulling in glucose and inhibiting free fatty acid release, and you would faint because there would be insufficient other nutrients in your blood. So I wouldn't have stimulated your fat cells to grow at all because there's no fuel for that growth. So I'm touching on a deeper debate now.
No, this is great.
Which is, why do we get fat and how do we lose it? But people, as much as we want to go into separate camps, and people will say, no, it's purely calories. We know that's not true. That is so easy to disprove that it's almost laughable that idea still has any credence. Because if we took a type 1 diabetic, our good friend Dr. Andrew Kutnick, if we took Andrew and had him eat 10,000 calories a day but deprived him of his insulin injection, he would look like a prisoner of war. He would be so skinny, even though he's clearly eating an abundance of calories. If you don't have insulin in an organism, from fruit flies to humans, it is utterly and completely impossible to store fat. So thus, insulin is an absolutely essential component to fat storage. No, but so are calories, because insulin alone isn't sufficient. We need insulin to tell the fat cell what to do with the energy that it has available to it. But we need the energy to actually fuel that growth. So insulin's going to tell the fat cells it's time to grow. But now the fat cell says to insulin, okay, but with what? Now the calories come in. So neither is sufficient on its own. And so this whole vicious debate, and it does get unfortunately vicious. Yeah. I try to actually take a diplomatic route, but people end up putting me into this endocrine theory of obesity camp, or the insulin theory, because of what I just said. And I'll say it again with an exclamation mark. You cannot store fat on a body unless insulin is elevated. It is totally impossible. And again, if insulin is absent or really low at low fasted levels, you can't keep that fat on the body. But again, as much as insulin is a necessary component to signal the growth of the fat cell, you have to have sufficient energy to fuel that growth. And that's where the calories, of course, come in, although I kind of changed the topic here.
No, this is wild. And I want to come back to another question that I had that was surrounding, okay, let's say you have a healthy person, like metabolically healthy, very insulin sensitive. Because that person is insulin sensitive, even in a healthy cohort, is there potential to gain fat easier? So have they kind of shot them? I'm shooting themselves in the foot in some ways, like made themselves ultra insulin sensitive, that now they are more sensitive to the deposition or the growth of a fat cell. Yeah.
So the more insulin sensitive a person is, the more potential they have to get fat. But that's not overly surprising, because it just reflects this sort of negative feedback or kind of diminishing returns idea of fat gain, that the more fat a person's gaining, the more the body starts to resist that fat gain, assuming that they're getting fat through the hypertrophy of the fat cells, which again is how most people get fat. However, that's the kind of bad news. Like if someone hearing us talking says, oh great, I'm insulin sensitive, I'm going to gain more fat more easily than my insulin resistant overweight buddy. That's true, because your buddy's already kind of peaked on the curve. You know, it's this accelerating curve, and the person who's very insulin sensitive is at the bottom, and so they can accelerate weight gain more rapidly. The person who's already been gaining it, they're already starting to plateau, and so it's that diminishing effect of fat storage. However, by being insulin sensitive, they have a little bit of a protection, because a little insulin does the job quickly. And by the job, I mean it's able to correct blood glucose very quickly. So as much as the insulin per unit time has a greater ability to promote fat storage on the insulin sensitive person, it's also up for a shorter period of time. So if we took an insulin sensitive individual and an insulin resistant individual, and they both consumed 50 grams of glucose, the insulin-sensitive guy, his insulin levels have gone up maybe from around 3 microunits per mil up to 30 or so, and they're back down to totally normal within 45 minutes. The insulin resist, maybe an hour, 90 minutes, actually. I should have gone a little longer, about 90 minutes. The insulin resistant guy, same 50 grams, now his insulin has been elevated for 4 hours. And so on the first guy, the insulin is a little more effective at promoting fat gain, but it also was elevated for a substantially shorter period of time. On the insulin resistant guy, he's become a little resistant to the fat promoting effects of the insulin, but it was also elevated for 2 or 3 times as long. And so it's a bit of a trade-off.
Yeah. It also makes sense as to why, like when you see, maybe a bodybuilder that gets insanely lean and, for a show, how quickly they go back from 4% up to 10%.
Yep.
I mean, it's very fast, right?
Yeah.
Whereas then it takes them months to go from maybe 10% to 15%.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. I mean, it absolutely really could be just if someone can imagine this curve, which is going up really quickly and then it's starting to plateau a little bit.
Makes a ton of sense. When you look at carbohydrate consumption and insulin, I've often wondered this question. You're the perfect person to ask for it. If you have lower glycemic carbohydrates and you have like gentle bell curve and then another consumption of low glycemic, are you basically getting gentle bell curve on top of gentle bell curve on top of gentle bell curve, where as far as where you're ultimately landing with insulin levels ends up being higher than if you were to just say have a bolus of somewhat high glycemic, have a spike and come back down?
Yeah.
Like, is it better to have insulin do its job, come back down? And what I'm getting at is like allocation of carbohydrate consumption to maybe 1 bolus per day and then come back lower, or frequent smaller boluses.
Yeah. I wish I could cite a definitive study on this question, so I have to speculate because I don't know that this has been done. I am speculating. A lot of the reason I put carbohydrates in the crosshairs is because of what it does to insulin. I want to make sure people understand that I'm not declaring war on carbohydrates because of the entire macronutrient class. It really is the subsequent question, which is what does it do to insulin? So I appreciate the question because that's how you're framing it. Remember, with that in mind, insulin's most famous action, but far from its only action. And I would even say not even its most important, but insulin's most famous action is to control blood sugar. Now, I emphasize that because a lot of what is wrong in modern clinical care when it comes to insulin resistance and type 2 diabetes therapies is that they think it's a glucose problem. It's not. These are insulin problems. And if we look at them as insulin problems, we address them much more effectively than if we look at them as a glucose problem. But that's a little bit of a tangent. But even still, if we're asking the question, what happens to insulin? My question is always, or my solution is always, the longer you spend in a state of low insulin, the better. For being lean, for cognitive health, for cardiometabolic health, all of these reasons, longevity, the more insulin is at a kind of basal state, overall, the better you're going to be. So I would actually say it would be 1 bolus up and down would be better, especially because you can manage that 1 dose. If you know, okay, lunch is my main carb meal, then you're able to couple that with, I'm going to eat this bigger carb meal and I'm going to go on a 15-minute walk. Or it's just so much easier to manage that 1 moment rather than, okay, I'm eating some carbs now, I'm getting an insulin spike, and before it ever comes down, I'm eating some more. Now I'm eating some more, but I'm spreading it out more. I think that's actually part of what's gotten to the modern epidemic that we're in with regards to metabolic health. Insulin resistance is the most common health disorder worldwide, which is why I beat that drum so loudly. The reason I did my postdoctoral fellowship in far-flung but lovely Singapore is because even in the midst of the beautiful islands of Southeast Asia, the actual rate of type 2 diabetes is higher than we have it in the US, in beautiful little Singapore. And as you look around the world, the Middle East, North Asia, Southeast Asia, Pacific Islands, even in our own neck of the woods, Mexico has higher rates of diabetes than we do in the US. This is an absolutely global problem. And a lot of it is because about 71% of all calories consumed globally are carbohydrates, often refined. And we've been told to eat 5 or 6 times a day. And so you never give your body a chance to lower the insulin because it's going to take a couple hours to do so. And the longer a person is living with elevated insulin, the more that chronically elevated insulin is causing insulin resistance. Elevated insulin is the primary driver of insulin resistance. But then, of course, to the astute listener, they might recall that just moments ago I said that hyperinsulinemia or elevated insulin is also a chronic feature, an inseparable feature of insulin resistance. So you end up creating this vicious cycle where the more frequently you're spiking your insulin, the more you're promoting insulin resistance, then the more insulin you need to control your blood sugar now because insulin isn't working as well, which is further driving insulin resistance. So the solution is to just get off this hyperglycemic roller coaster. But anyway, to bring it full circle back to your question, with some speculation noted, I would suspect it's better to just have one bolus. Get those starches and sugars in. You've done it. You're done. Now, as rapidly as you can, you want to bring that insulin back down. Now, I don't even want to sound like insulin is just this uniform villain. We must have it. The absence of insulin is a death sentence. It's just that we live now in a day in time where we're spiking it all the time. And it's just too much of a good thing. Too much insulin is the primary cause of insulin resistance.
Yeah. And I think it's safe to assume, no one's getting insulin resistance from the insulin spike you get from protein.
Oh, yeah. No, that's right. But in fact, even then, when I first became familiar with probably right around the time you and I first met, when I was first getting familiar with this low carb community, because remember, I'm a professor and a scientist. I was totally unaware of this whole community of, at the time, just kind of low carb, if not advocates, then enthusiasts or travelers, along the path of learning more about it. Then I was invited to speak at this first lay meeting, and then it was the year or so later when I think you and I met at the Metabolic Health Summit. But one of those early talks I gave was to dispel the idea of protein being a problem on a ketogenic diet, where it was very odd to me to see as an outsider, as just a pure scientist, people saying, well, don't eat too much protein because you don't want to get kicked out of ketosis. And I just thought, what an odd concern, especially in the context of a low-carb diet, because a lot of the evidence has shown that the insulinogenic response to a dietary protein load really depends on the underlying glucose level. So to put that very clearly, if someone eats a protein load in the absence of glucose and they have normal glucose levels, there is little to no insulin release. This is very Nuttall, N-U-T-T-A-L, through a series of experiments, really nailed this and displayed it really well. So again, if a person eats a pure load of protein in the absence of any glucose and they have normal glucose levels at the time, there's very little insulin spike. If a person takes that protein with glucose or has underlying hyperglycemia, then you will get an insulin spike and you will amplify it beyond the carbohydrate alone. And that's really in part because of what the body has to do to keep gluconeogenesis happening. If you're fasted or on a ketogenic diet, if you spike insulin, you stop gluconeogenesis and you would become hypoglycemic very quickly and you would likely go unconscious. And so that makes sense that the body won't elicit an insulin spike, because if it did, again, it would shut off the liver's ability to make new glucose. And so you can't sustain it. But that does present a bit of a note of caution, as much as you and I both are big advocates of protein, and I am. And I made this whole talk on YouTube, the insulin to glucagon ratio when it comes to protein consumption, where I presented some of these ideas. If a person has type 2 diabetes, they actually may find that controlling protein a little bit is helpful in that population. But there's a lot of nuance there. But on average, I'm an enormous advocate of protein. Even if there is an insulin bump, it is a macronutrient that I'm tremendously in favor of. Now, having said that, lest someone misinterpret it, I'm an advocate of natural protein, especially, which is the protein that it's always going to be animal. Natural protein is animal source protein, and natural protein always has fat. There's almost no instance in nature of a protein not coming with fat. And I believe that's how we should consume it. We do have human evidence to show that if a population of humans works out, they eat protein, they get a certain greater degree of muscle protein synthesis. If they eat protein and fat, they get even more muscle protein synthesis. Part of this could be because of what the assistance of bile. As much as we think of fat digestion and we think of bile coming from the liver, then the bile duct or the gallbladder as being only relevant to fat consumption, and it is very important for fat consumption, but we also use bile to accelerate the proteolytic enzymes of digestion in the gut. So we have these distinct class of enzymes, the proteolytic enzymes that help with protein digestion. We have bile and then some fat-specific enzymes to help with fat digestion, but bile also facilitates the actions of the proteolytic enzymes. And I don't think it's an accident, again, that in nature, all fats come with protein. In our fear of fat, we have separated the two, and I think that's why a lot of people, if they find they just take pure protein, it really upsets their intestines. They probably because they're losing out on the facilitative actions of the bile, which helps protein digestion, but you're only going to be releasing the bile if you eat some fat. So as much as I am an advocate of protein, and I am happy to admit it, I also don't want that to be taken as I'm now suddenly saying it's more important than anything else. Protein is important, but so too is the fat that's supposed to come with it.
Wow, that's wild. I mean, that's interesting to me because, you know, coming from like a fitness perspective, like it was always talked about how, I shouldn't say always, you know, some of like Charles Poliquin type stuff, like somewhat speculative, but it was like then somewhat validated where, okay, like, hey, like you finish your workout, like you're insulin sensitive, like now's the time to have your whey protein shake, just get a lean, easy protein.
Yeah.
So is there evidence even like post-workout that sans carbs, just having like some ground beef, some fat in it might actually get you more protein synthesis than say a whey protein shake?
Yeah, well, so this study, I don't know, I can't remember the timing of it. Like, did they give it? I wish I could remember whether they gave it at a specific time, like within a certain window following the workout. And I just can't recall. But the protein and the fat they used was egg. They used egg white alone, which is a very good protein. And then they used the whole egg. So the magic of an egg, in my mind, is that it's a 1-to-1 ratio of fat by mass to protein by mass. And that in that study, the whole egg consumption, so the fat and the protein together was more anabolic than the protein alone. I don't know of comparable studies with, say, whey. Like if you have whey and then you add dairy fat, and I am an enormous advocate of dairy fat. I'm an advocate of all natural fats. I really am. But there's some nuance there where people need to appreciate that if you are asking a muscle cell to undergo hypertrophy, which is largely a function of the protein. So that's where the proteins come into play. That's where the amino acids come into play, particularly branched chain amino acids. They're helping build the structure of the interior of that muscle cell. But as the muscle cell is expanding, the membrane is primarily made of fat. And so if you're asking this muscle cell to get big and you're only providing it with the building blocks on the inside, what a pressure on the outside. So if you can be giving it some of these long chain fats that are now helping build the structure of the exterior, especially phospholipids, which are particularly loaded in animal fats, now you're also helping with the exterior of it, the membrane of it. You're allowing the membrane to continue to expand as we're demanding that the interior protein increase.
So is there not so much, and I'm asking honestly from my own personal, you know, it's not uncommon, like actually a lot of times, most of the time after a workout, I just don't even bother eating. Like I still stay fasted for a while because I'm not concerned. I think, I don't know, you've probably seen.
Oh, no, that's absolutely valid.
Like it's totally
like Dr. Stuart Phillips, one of the leading authorities on muscle protein synthesis, and Luc Van Loon at Maastricht, also one of the absolute authorities, they've referred to protein as rather than a window, it's like a barn door. Yeah, totally. That really, as long as you're getting some adequate amount within a pretty broad range, then you're laughing.
I don't trip up about it at all, but it's interesting because, you know, it's drilled into my head from even bodybuilding days in the past. It's like, okay, have your whey protein isolate. So you're not even getting the full spectrum of you know, with water, you know, not with milk. So, and it's like, now I'm almost thinking like, okay, maybe a whey protein concentrate with whole milk is better.
In fact, absolutely. That's what I would say. Now, of course, I would defer to a bodybuilder. You know, that's not something I've ever experimented with. But particularly for the average individual who just wants to be healthy and strong and not worrying about getting to a 4% body fat, which from everything I understand is a miserable way to live. Yeah, like you talk to any of these bodybuilders during their cutting phase, they are totally obsessed with one thing and one thing only, and it's food. Yeah. Like at any given moment, it's food that they're talking about and thinking about. But that to me is important. I hate to go off on a tangent,
no, for sure.
But when we invoke the same principles, like people who just say, no, eat just all protein and cut all of their calories, that is the way the bodybuilder is going to be cutting. But those guys have an unnatural degree of discipline. You know, these are guys who are used to just punishing their bodies and gritting their teeth and getting through whatever the trial is, including this constant obsession with food. When we take that same strategy and then give it to an overweight type 2 diabetic, well, no wonder it fails so often, because now you're asking them to work against hunger. If the dietary, back to the same ideas where I just outlined, I hope convincingly, that in order for a fat cell to grow, you need two components: elevated insulin and sufficient calories to fuel the growth that the insulin's signaling. Those same two variables then get turned down, of course, when you start to talk about how we shrink fat cells. But most people, and both are elevated. If a person's getting fatter and fatter, they have elevated insulin to signal the growth and sufficient calories to fuel the growth. Both of them need to be turned down. Unfortunately, the overwhelming conversation only focuses on one of those variables, which is the calories. So if you have an individual who begins cutting their calories, but they still have this underlying hyperinsulinemia, Dr. David Ludwig published a series of papers out of Harvard, which are beautiful, that look at the available amount of energy in the blood. And I referenced this earlier in our conversation. But if you are cutting calories, but insulin is still high, you are pushing all the calorie nutrients into the tissues. And that leaves a lower amount of calorie nutrients available in the blood. And the brain senses this. The brain has a limited capacity to store energy. And thus the brain says, hey, we're getting low on energy in the blood, because it can't sense what's stored in the fat or the liver directly, and so it starts to promote greater hunger. And so if a person's weight loss or fat cell shrinking journey starts with cutting calories, they're very quickly going to return right to where they started, because if they haven't addressed the high insulin, they're going to become very, very hungry. This is why when you look at these Biggest Loser game shows, you never see a reunion. Yeah. You never see them get back together because they gain it all back. So as much as calories matter, my strong advice is start with the low insulin approach. You just control your carbs, prioritize protein, don't fear the fat that comes with that protein. Now, and don't worry about the calories, because if you correct your insulin, you will have a higher metabolic rate by about 200 to 300 calories a day just by lowering insulin. Calorie expenditure, metabolic rate will just go up. This is reflective of insulin is so good at telling the body to store energy that when it's absent or when it goes down, the body is spending it more readily than it would normally. So metabolic rate will go up, and then you will start wasting energy in the form of ketones. So if insulin is down, the person's burning a lot of fat because insulin controls which fuel is being used. And when insulin is down for an extended period of time, about 16 hours, the body is burning so much fat that the liver is actually burning more fat than it needs to meet its own energetic needs. So the liver is basically saying, hey, I don't need any more energy. But also the liver is saying, yeah, but I can't stop burning fat because insulin's low. That excess is what is turned into ketones. And then now what about the ketones? They have a caloric value. Every ketone has a caloric value roughly similar to glucose. And when a person's in ketosis, you are now directly eliminating those ketones from the breath and in the urine. Well, those are calories that, based on the typical view of thermodynamics, we would say, well, they have to be burned through exercise or stored, or they can just be wasted if insulin is low. So that represents another mechanism whereby a low insulin approach is very helpful for weight loss, because you are literally wasting energy. You're breathing these ketones out or you're urinating them out. And so eventually the person's going to lose a certain amount of weight by just addressing the insulin, not even counting calories. And then if they find that they get to a plateau, then I say, okay, now it's time to scrutinize calories. But the best way, in my view, to do that is through structured fasting rather than through kind of constant deprivation and this underlying hunger that comes with it. So anyway, that was a bit of a tangent, but even still, it allows me to kind of bring in a lot of other points.
No, one last question on this, because this is, if someone were to, let's say, basal metabolic rate of, I don't know, let's just say, just make it easy math, 2,000, and they were to eat, put themselves in a deficit down to 1,000 calories, but they only ate carbohydrates. Yeah. So insulin was spiked. Obviously, they would lose weight, but would they just retain fat mass and lose muscle mass?
Yeah, what a great question. So they would lose weight, but it would be relatively more lean mass than fat mass as a percent. Now, what you've done here is actually allow me to touch on a really important point, which is a lot of people will cite these low carb versus low fat studies. And they'll say, well, look at the degree of fat loss. It's always pretty close. Although, mind you, there has literally never been one single paper published finding that the low fat diet caused more statistically significant weight loss. Not one. Yeah. But there are several that show the low carb diet having a significantly greater effect, but never one in the other direction. But even still, they will say, look at both of these studies, both of them lost weight, or both groups, low carb versus low fat. Yeah, but they're always low calorie. That's the thing that people don't appreciate, is that you've taken someone eating a standard American diet, high fat, high carb, relatively high calorie. Even when you put them in the low fat group, you've cut their calories down. So they're eating less of everything now, even less glucose. And so it's not surprising that their insulin is also reduced. And so you always have this huge confounding variable. So just to finish that thought, and then I'll come back to the issue you brought up, the actual only way to truly declare a winner, whether low carb is better or low fat is better, is you have to see which one is more resistant to fat gain. So rather than doing these hypocaloric studies, what we have to do, and it's never been done ever, do a hypercaloric version of both diets. So you take a ketogenic, low carb, but matched with calories to a high carb, but they're both high calorie. And now let's see who gets fat less, if that makes sense. Now we can actually start to tease apart the difference between the insulin theory of obesity or the caloric theory of obesity. But if we take the average person and they're only eating glucose at 1,000 grams, 1,000 calories, they're probably still eating less overall than they clearly were than when they're eating. Yeah, so if they have let's just say they were eating 2,000 calories and they were weight stable. Yeah, insulin would still come down in that individual, and they may have an underlying a little bit of some bits of hyperglycemia, but I've not seen a study that's done this. I suspect if you compared that person to the person eating 1,000 calories of pure fat, the person eating the pure fat, let's say they both lose 10 pounds, but I bet as a percent of body fat, the fat eater is lost more fat because fat does not increase insulin at all. Anyone who says otherwise is looking at type 1 diabetes studies, and that's a very different metabolic milieu because of the underlying hyperglucagonemia, which changes the metrics a bit. But if you take a non-diabetic and they eat pure fat, there's no insulin spike whatsoever. This has been published for decades. I'm about to publish my own report looking at this exact same thing. So fat alone elicits no insulin spike, so that guy's going to have a higher metabolic rate. And because the insulin is low, he's going to be burning fat like gangbusters. The other guy who's eating 1,000 calories of glucose, he's still going to lose weight, of course, but I suspect that as a percent, he's losing a little more lean mass and preserving a little bit of fat mass.
So what would your suggestion be to the person that still wants to have carbohydrates? Mm-hmm. Maybe they want to have 100 grams of carbohydrates a day, and they're moderately active, they recreationally work out. And we'll kind of end on this so there's a takeaway. Yeah. Like, what would you suggest? Periodic fasting, keeping, what would your sort of playbook be for that person?
Yeah. So just as a reminder, my kind of 3 pillars are control carbs, prioritize protein, and don't fear fat. And with control carbs, it is first for a reason, because I consider it the most important. As much as possible, you'd want those 100 grams of carbs to not be coming from bags and boxes with barcodes. You'd want them to be whole fruits and vegetables. And the difference with the whole fruit and vegetable as opposed to the processed starches and sugars is the presence of fiber. So focus on fiber. If you're eating digestible carbohydrate, very likely nature has a fiber that's coming with it. And that's by design, and that's how we should take it. But still, if it's the 100 grams, I would say you want to get that not for supper. Not for the last meal of the day, because you do not want to go to bed hyperglycemic. Hyperglycemia stimulates the sympathetic nervous system, and I'm convinced one of the main reasons most people sleep so poorly these days, and I'm sympathetic to that, I'm inherently a bad sleeper, a lot of it is because they spike their glucose before they go to bed, because that's when most people indulge in starchy and sugary snacks. And then they have activated their sympathetic nervous system, so their body temperature climbs and their heart rate goes up and it's beating harder. And so they're lying in bed wondering why they can't fall asleep and wondering what they're anxious about. They're not anxious about anything. You just are hyperglycemic, and that activated your sympathetic nervous system, this fight or flight response. So you want to give yourself abundant time to get back to normal glycemia before you go to bed. So my advice always is load up lunch. Let lunch be the biggest meal, especially if a person is not inclined to have breakfast. Even though if you are a breakfast eater and that's when you find you're the hungriest, then you could load up those carbs for breakfast then. But lunch is a good way to do it. For me personally, I'm my late 40s. I don't have a lot going for me physically, and so I got to do what I can to stay fit, right? It's part of my marriage contract for my darling wife that I'm just going to do what I can to stay fit. But I want to be a healthy grandpa, of course. That's very much an interest for me. And I'm worried about some chronic diseases. And so I'm unapologetically an advocate of ketones, at least for some time of the day. If a person can have some brief period of ketones, that is going to be so helpful for brain health. And of all the diseases that scare me, Alzheimer's is probably the one that scares me the most.
Ditto.
Yeah, and especially for me, my brain is my moneymaker. Like, this is how I make my living. And so I need it to be really sharp. Study after study has shown that the brain loves ketones. I want to give my brain a break from relying on glucose and allow it to consume ketones, which it does incredibly readily. This is, as a brief tangent, this is one of the things I disabuse my students of so often. They've been taught that the brain prefers glucose. That is absolutely false. Even if you have a body that has, say, 5 millimolar glucose and only 2 millimolar ketones, which is very achievable with a fast, the brain is already getting about 70% of its energy from those ketones. So even when the ketones are at half the level of the glucose, the ketones are already providing 2 to 3 times more energy to the brain than the glucose is. So the brain loves ketones. I want to give my brain some ketones, and to do that, I fast through breakfast almost all the time, which is not so hard. I'm not generally very hungry, and it doesn't change the dynamic in my family. I'm married, I got kids. I don't want my kids to be looking across the table at dad wondering why dad's not eating. That's weird. And so I never fast through dinner. That's my one kind of cardinal rule. I have dinner with my family. If there's a way for me to keep it kind of low carb, and my wife generally sees this the way I do, so it's not too hard, then I do. But if my daughter wanted pizza for her birthday, we literally just celebrated her birthday yesterday when we recorded this, I'm going to eat pizza with my daughter. I'm not going to make it weird. So dinner is whatever the family's having. My lunch is generally, but if I'm going to load up my carbs, I would do it for lunch. All things equal, if I could, I'd load it up at lunch. And then breakfast, I generally am just fasting through anyway. So if you're going to take those 100 grams of carbs, I'd say focus on lunch as much as you can, given the social constraints that some people may have and given their natural habits. But at all costs, try not to get those carbs within 3 to 4 hours or so of going to bed. You just do not want to go to bed hyperglycemic.
Perfect. Well, Ben, where can everyone find you, man?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, so I try to put all my content and stuff more and more on my Insulin IQ website. So I got an Insulin IQ YouTube channel and my insuliniq.com website.
Beautiful. Thanks, Ben.
You bet.